For 13 days, in October 1962, the world held its breath. Two superpowers, armed with weapons that could end human civilization, stood face to face, separated by a single decision, a single misunderstanding, a single mistake. It was the closest the human race has ever come to destroying itself, not in a great battle, but in a silent standoff over a small island in the Caribbean. This is the story of how it happened, and how, by a razor-thin margin, we survived it. Let's break down the 13 days that nearly ended the world. To understand the crisis, you have to understand the world it grew out of. By 1962, the Second World War was less than 20 years past, but the alliance that won it had collapsed. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two great victors, were now locked in a global rivalry called the Cold War. It was a war fought not on a single front, but everywhere at once, in propaganda, in spies, in proxy conflicts, and above all, in a terrifying race to build more and deadlier nuclear weapons. Both sides now possessed the power to obliterate the other. Strategists gave this grim balance a fitting name: mutually assured destruction. Peace was held in place by the certainty that any real war would kill everyone. And 90 miles off the coast of the United States sat a new flashpoint, the island of Cuba. A few years earlier, a revolution had brought Fidel Castro to power in Cuba and pushed the island into the arms of the Soviet Union. For the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, this was an extraordinary opportunity. The Americans had stationed nuclear missiles in Europe, in Italy, and in Turkey, right on the Soviet border. So Khrushchev made a bold and dangerous gamble. In secret, he would ship nuclear missiles to Cuba, placing Soviet warheads within striking distance of American cities and changing the balance of the Cold War overnight. Through the summer of 1962, Soviet ships crossed the Atlantic, their cargo hidden. Engineers and missiles arrived on the island, and construction began deep in the Cuban countryside, all of it concealed from American eyes, or so they believed. On the 14th of October, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flew high over Cuba, its cameras running. When the photographs were developed and analyzed, the experts saw something that stopped them cold: the unmistakable signature of Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction. These were not defensive weapons. They were offensive nuclear missiles, capable of reaching much of the United States within minutes, carrying warheads many times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The photographs were rushed to the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. On the morning of the 16th of October, he was shown the evidence. The crisis had begun. Kennedy gathered a small, secret group of his closest advisors. History would remember them as ExComm, the Executive Committee. For days, behind closed doors, these men debated the most consequential question imaginable. What do you do when your enemy has secretly aimed nuclear weapons at your country? The options were laid out, and every one of them was terrible. Do nothing and accept the missiles, launch airstrikes to destroy them and risk killing Soviet troops, triggering all-out war, or invade Cuba outright. The military pressed for force, but Kennedy and his brother Robert feared that a single shot could spiral uncontrollably into a nuclear exchange that no one could stop. They searched for a path between surrender and annihilation. On the 22nd of October, Kennedy went on television and told the American people the truth. He announced that the United States had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba and that America would respond with a naval blockade. To avoid the word blockade, which is an act of war, they called it a quarantine. U.S. Navy ships would ring the island and turn back any vessel carrying weapons. The message to Moscow was clear: the missiles must be removed, and until they were, an American wall of steel would stand in the water around Cuba. The world now knew, and the world was terrified. Across America, people prepared for a war they prayed would never come. Now came the most dangerous moment of all. Soviet ships were steaming toward the quarantine line, and the world waited to see whether they would stop or force the confrontation. American forces went to a heightened state of nuclear alert. Bombers were in the air around the clock. Missiles stood ready. A single order could begin the end. And then the Soviet ships slowed. Some stopped. Some turned back. One American official captured the moment in a now-famous line, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. But it was far from over. The missiles already in Cuba were still being prepared, and the longer the standoff lasted, the more ways there were for it to go catastrophically wrong. The 27th of October would become known as Black Saturday, the day the crisis came within a hair's breadth of nuclear war. That day, an American U-2 was shot down over Cuba, and its pilot was killed. The military demanded retaliation. The pressure on Kennedy to strike was now enormous. What almost no one knew was how close the edge truly was. Beneath the waves, a Soviet submarine, hunted by American ships dropping warning depth charges, lost contact with Moscow. Its exhausted officers, believing war might already have begun, considered launching a nuclear torpedo. The launch required the agreement of the senior officers aboard. One of them refused. That single act of restraint in the dark of the ocean may have saved the world. The decision did not go forward. While the world stood at the brink, a secret correspondence had been flowing between Kennedy and Khrushchev, two frightened men, each desperate to stop what they had started. In the end, a deal was reached. Publicly, the Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade the island. And privately, kept secret for years, the United States agreed to quietly remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey. Both leaders could step back, both could survive. Neither had to choose between humiliation and war. On the 28th of October, Moscow announced that the missiles would be withdrawn. After 13 days, the world exhaled. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended without a shot fired between the superpowers, but it left a permanent mark on history. Here is the lesson that still echoes today. The crisis was not resolved by strength alone, but by restraint, by leaders who, at the final moment, chose to find a way out rather than a way to win. And it revealed a terrifying truth about the nuclear age, that the world could be brought to the edge of destruction not by a grand plan, but by miscommunication, by pressure, by accident. In the aftermath, a direct line, the famous hotline, was set up between Washington and Moscow so the two powers could always talk. The first treaties to limit nuclear testing soon followed. Both sides had stared into the abyss and stepped back. For 13 days in 1962, the survival of civilization rested on the judgment of a handful of people. We survived, but the crisis remains a warning written in the language of the atom. In the nuclear age, there can be no winners, only survivors. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the moment the Cold War nearly turned hot, the closest the world has ever come to the end. But the rivalry that drove it would soon ignite another conflict, a long, brutal war in the jungles of Southeast Asia that would define a generation and humble a superpower, the Vietnam War. Subscribe, and we'll see you there.